Then Ms. Hildebrandt, how do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
Business partner and co-defendant of momfluencer Ruby Franke enters her own guilty plea in a Utah courtroom to heinous child abuse charges. We're breaking down the rise and fall of Jodi Hildebrandt. Plus, we sit down with Hildebrandt's niece, who has been open about the alleged abuse they suffered at their aunt's hand, to get their reaction to Jodi's plea agreement and expected prison time. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. 54-year-old Jodi Nan Hildebrandt is preparing to spend years in prison after she admitted to abusing 2 of her business partner's children inside of her home. That business partner, Ruby Franke, also entered into her own guilty plea agreement, with sentencing now expected in February. We've told you all about Ruby's past in previous Sidebar episodes. Now let's do a deep dive into Jodi Hildebrandt's past, because it's important to understand where she came from, how she ended up here. So according to her LinkedIn page, Jodi Hildebrandt has a Bachelor in Arts in English Language and Literature from Brigham Young University and a master's degree in Education Psychology from the University of Utah. Her LinkedIn page says that she served as a program director for Cirque Lodge in the early 2000s. Cirque Lodge is billed as a private luxury rehab for treatment of drug and alcohol addiction. Hildebrandt was first licensed as a clinical mental health counselor in Utah in July of 2005. We believe in 2007, Hildebrandt wrote the curriculum for Connections Classroom, a life coaching program that offered therapy through workbooks, videos, group sessions, and more.
Welcome to Connections. I'm Jodi Hildebrandt. So glad you're with us.
On the Connections website, Hildebrandt stated, quote, "Overall, I desire to help our generation and the generations to come dispose of distortion's ugly lies in order to live in truth, connection, and freedom."
So when I think about the word hijacked, I think about distortion. I think about the characteristics of distortion. So control is a characteristic of distortion. Engaging in any form of deception, so manipulation, secrecy, hiding, entitlement, aggression, threatening, bullying, blaming. All of those presentations are all distorted because they all have the underpinning of deception.
Now, on the Connections website, Ruby Franke, she's listed as a, quote, certified mental fitness trainer, although it's unclear what qualifications, if any, she had for that title. Now, over the last few years, Franke and Hildebrandt have appeared in Connections videos together after Franke stopped posting to her family's YouTube channel called 8 Passengers, a very popular channel, posted over 2 million subscribers. See, she had gotten blowback from viewers and fellow vloggers for her parenting tactics.
I've shared with Ruby numerous times that anger is actually one of my most favorite emotions.
When I first started getting to know you, she's like, anger is my favorite emotion. I'm like, I don't know what I'm dealing with here.
But in 2012, the Department of Commerce's Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing put Hildebrandt's license on probation for 18 months for, quote, unprofessional conduct. She was accused of discussing the private, sensitive information of a patient with Mormon church leaders, as well as Brigham Young University, without the patient's permission. But after that probationary period, her license was reinstated. Now, at last check, Hildebrandt's clinical mental health license is still listed as limited active. In September, the Utah Division of Professional Licensing gave it that status so that Hildebrandt couldn't practice as a counselor until her legal case had been resolved. By the way, since all of this happened, people have spoken out about Hildebrandt's counseling, talking about manipulation, coercion, torture. In fact, the attorney for Kevin Franke, that's Ruby's husband, he spoke to us about what effect Hildebrandt had on the Franke family.
But Ruby felt like there were differences in their marriage, and at one point, in conjunction with Jodi Hildebrandt, it was sort of like, we have to separate to save our marriage. You know, we'll keep working on our marriage, but for now, you know, if we're gonna repair our marriage and be back together as a family, you have to be away. I don't think he's made that parallel. I don't think that he believes that's what led up to this. But what I can say, at least it's my observation, that while the family may have had some struggles prior to Jodi coming into their lives, it just kind of seems like to me, and this is my personal opinion, that once she got involved in their lives, it just destroyed his family. The focus has been on Kevin. Where was he? Why was he absent? How does that all happen? So he was doing that at Ruby's direction, who I think was being directed by Jodi. That this is the way that you've got to repair your marriage and repair your family. So they were all sort of kind of being manipulated, and this is just my opinion, by Jodi. And I think she knew what she was doing, and it was causing significant damage. And so when Kevin's critics are out there saying, where was he? He was acting at the direction of what he thought was a competent mental health care provider and advisor. And to me, the better question is, what kind of mental health care provider would advise a family and a husband and wife and a husband and or a father and children that this can repair your family if you just stay away from each other? And I'm confident that she told that to Ruby. I'm confident that the children were being told that, and Kevin was certainly being told that I know what I'm doing, you need to stay away.
So now the question is, how did Hildebrandt come to the attention of law enforcement, right? Well, in August of 2023, a neighbor of Hildebrandt's called police saying that a young boy had shown up at his property looking for help.
This kid has obviously been, I think he's been detained. He's obviously covered in wounds.
Yeah, Ruby Franke's youngest son, 12-year-old Russell, had apparently escaped from Jodi Hildebrandt's home.
You know there's been problems at this neighbor's house. He's emaciated, he's got tape around his legs, he's hungry, and he's thirsty.
Yeah, when first responders got there, they found Russell, as well as his sister, 9-year-old Eve. They were emaciated and malnourished, so they were rushed to a hospital. There was also evidence that Russell was tied up and sustained injuries from his bindings. Franke's 2 middle daughters, they were found at another home in American Fork, Utah, with another member of Connections. They, along with the 2 youngest kids, were taken into state custody. By the way, the oldest children, Sherry and Chad, they're adults now. But both Franke and Hildebrandt, they were arrested and held without bond. They were each charged with 6 counts of aggravated child abuse. In December, we learned that both women had separate waiver hearings scheduled when we might expect plea agreements to be announced. Franke's hearing was first on December 18th, and she agreed to plead guilty in open court to 4 of the child abuse charges.
Ms. Franke, how do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
To count 3, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
To count 5, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
And to count 6, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
With my deepest regret and sorrow for my family and my children, guilty.
Now, the other 2 charges, they were dropped. These were the child abuse charges constituting starvation or malnutrition. And as part of her deal, Franke agreed to testify against Jodi Hildebrandt. In fact, before this hearing, Ruby's law firm released a statement saying in part, quote, initially, Ms. Franke believed that Jodi Hildebrandt had the insight to offer a path to continual improvement. Ms. Hildebrandt took advantage of this quest and twisted it into something heinous. Over an extended period, Ms. Hildebrandt systematically isolated Ruby Franke from her extended family, older children, and her husband, Kevin Franke. This prolonged isolation resulted in Ms. Franke being subjected to a distorted sense of morality shaped by Ms. Hildebrandt's influence, which is maybe why it was not entirely that surprising that Hildebrandt decided to plead guilty. On December 27th, Hildebrandt appeared in a jail jumpsuit alongside her lawyer to officially enter her own plea.
Then, Ms. Hildebrandt, how do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
And to count 3, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
To count 5, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
And to count 6, also aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
In the plea agreement documents, Hildebrandt admitted to multiple abusive acts in an almost identical list of Ruby Franke's, which included forcing Russell and Eve to work outside in direct sunlight, eat during the summer months, denying them food and water, However, where you see a difference is that in Hildebrandt's plea agreement, it does say she either physically forced or coerced Eve to jump into a cactus multiple times. Both children were told that they were evil or possessed, that these acts were necessary and done out of love. After the December 27th hearing, Hildebrandt's defense attorney explained some of the reasons she chose to take a plea.
Ms. Hildebrandt, my client, has pled guilty today to 4 counts. She has done so because she takes responsibility for her conduct in this matter. Her guilty pleas, she decided to plead guilty before Ms. Franke entered into her plea agreement or agreed to cooperate with the state. She has pled guilty because she did not want these children to have to testify. She takes responsibility. And it is her main concern at this point that these children can heal, both physically and emotionally. We look forward to sentencing. That's all I have to say today.
Also, the 2 counts that I mentioned that were dropped in the Franke case, they were also dropped in the Hildebrandt case. And the prosecutor also spoke outside of court about why 2 of these counts of child abuse were dropped for Franke and Hildebrandt.
If our plea offer had been there is no plea offer, plead straight up to all 6, then the defendant has no incentive to go to trial. And we're not afraid of trials. We don't want to avoid trials. Trials carry some risk in that you don't know what the outcome's going to be, but more so when you have victims that are having to go through the trial process, that's difficult.
So now with all of that, Hildebrandt and Franke, they will both be sentenced in February, and they each face up to 15 years in prison for each count. The sentences are also going to run consecutively, meaning one after the other. It's pretty chilling talking about Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke, and it makes you think about how unsafe the world can be at times. Well, our partner and sponsor of this video, Morgan & Morgan, the largest injury law firm in America, they can help tackle one of the scariest things in life. That is when you get hurt. Because if that happens, you may not know what to do. You're going to have so much on your plate. Well, Morgan & Morgan will make it super easy for you. They have completely modernized the process because you submit your claim, you sign contracts, you upload documents, you talk to your whole legal team all on your phone. That's it. An attorney is going to review your case in just 8 clicks. They also have 4,000 support staff that can help you through the process too, which is just amazing to think about. And in terms of price, you only pay them if you win. There's no upfront fee. So if you're injured and you want to join the over 3 million people that call them every year, you can submit a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar or by dialing pound law. That's pound 529 on your phone. All right, let's get back into the latest on Jodi Hildebrandt. We're getting insight from someone who experienced alleged abuse inside of Hildebrandt's home, her niece, Jessi Hildebrandt. Now, we have spoken with Jessi before here on Sidebar, talking about previous allegations that have a striking similarity to what happened to Franke's children inside of that Ivins, Utah home. Well, Jessi joins us again to discuss the latest developments in this case. Jessi, thank you so much for taking the time. I can't tell you how much I always appreciate you being very open with how you're feeling and what you experienced. And since we've spoken, so much has happened. I'm just going to ask you straight up your reaction to Jodi Hildebrandt pleading guilty.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey on my end of processing and reprocessing everything that's been going on. The day that it happened, I was surprisingly really angry. I didn't expect to feel so much anger kind of come up in that experience. I think part of it was when her lawyer came out and gave just the most ridiculous comment to the press about how Jodi is she pled guilty because she's just trying to, take accountability for her actions. And she just really cares about the kids healing and all of this garbage, just complete trash. That was pretty enraging. I mean, I can't imagine it actually changing anyone's mind or convincing anyone of like it's so obviously a manipulation tactic to save face. But that was pretty enraging. And then slowly throughout the day, like a lot of this weight just like slowly kind of lifted off my shoulders, and a lot of this subconscious fear that somehow she was going to be able to kind of wiggle her way out of any accountability slowly lifted. Yeah, so I was able to speak to the DA a little bit that evening, and he informed me that the likelihood of her getting maximum sentencing is incredibly high, that she's most likely going to be getting the 60 years.
Wow, that we were wondering that because again, 15 years is the max on
Yeah.
each charge, and again, look, the way that we understand it as well, from Utah law is it really isn't the judge who sets it. It's more like this is what punishment is, and it's up to a board to determine if she'll ever be granted parole. So, I mean, that's our
Yeah.
understanding about it.
Yeah, so he also told me that it's about 8 months from now that that board will be put together, and that's going to be like the first parole hearing will be in as little as 8 months.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to be focusing, like what the DA said, to be focusing on, like having a written statement of harm, and showing up to those hearings. And hopefully that this after this first one, that it will be pushed years down the line.
Well, first of all, were you there when she pled guilty, and do you plan to appear at her sentencing?
I was not there. I didn't want to be there. Um, or at least I was pretty torn on whether I wanted to be there or not. I won't be there for her sentencing simply because of just the timing of it. I'll be in Europe. Um, I would have liked to be there for the sentencings. I will be there for the parole hearing, most likely. That's, I think, where a lot of victims, like that's the important time for the victims to come forward and to convince the board that she doesn't deserve any sort of parole.
I thought it was really interesting when you said that it didn't seem genuine, her reason for pleading guilty. Obviously,
Oh.
from a legal point of view, there's a number of reasons why I think she did it. You had Ruby Franke agreeing to testify against her. Evidence looks really bad, but you don't believe in
That right there.
any way, you don't believe in any way she feels bad about what happened.
Not even a little bit. No, it's so wild because something that she would constantly um, accuse me of when I was living with her. So when the abuse started getting really bad, people in my church started noticing that I didn't look well and that something was wrong. And they started talking to the bishop or the pastor, the person in charge of our ward, um, just like their concerns. And the Bishop Bangader, told Jodi these people's names, and then we would go to their home, and she would coach me in the car and tell me exactly what I was going to say, and then she would go in with me, and I would have to apologize to them for manipulating them into feeling sorry. I believed that Jesus was working through Jodi, and that Jodi was saving me, and so it's just darkly ironic that watching her in the pews, like at the sentencing, just like looking so sad, and then telling like her attorney coming out and saying something like that is just like, wow, oh, you're manipulating all that time you were telling me that that's what I was doing was just a projection, because that's what you would do and are doing. Like it's like you don't get accused and like convicted of child torture, and then suddenly are like, oh, I just really care about these children's healing. Like that's not what happens.
Yeah.
You don't go 15 years of having this be a pattern and then suddenly be like, I just really care about these children. That's not possible.
And I wanted to ask you about that because now that the plea agreements have been entered, these court documents have been filed, and we now know more details about what happened to these kids. I mean, talking about Jodi Hildebrandt, as I mentioned earlier on in the show, she either physically forced or coerced a 9-year-old girl, Eve, to jump into a cactus multiple times. These two children were dehydrated. They weren't given food. They were made to work outside in the heat. Did it seem worse what happened to these kids, or just eerily similar to what you went through?
So a lot of it was similar. There were certain specifics that were not. I went on News Nation to give a statement right after the plea, and I didn't know about the cactus, and they had spoken about it right before they brought me on, and it was horrifying to hear about. Not surprising, but horrifying nonetheless. She, again, she's one of the most convincing, powerful humans you will ever meet. And when you are in a state of vulnerability, especially as a child, she can convince you of anything. I mean, I worked out in her garden in the middle of the summer. Like, we didn't live in southern Utah, so it was not as hot or as dry, but I was working out in her yard all summer. And, she used, withholding food, withholding water as a way of force. I mean, she would, she'd duct tape me and tied me up, but I was also a teenager. There's a very big difference between being 16 and going through something like this and being a 9-year-old. Like, there's just no way of comparing those two things.
It was horrifying. For me, I think it was worse than I even imagined. I mean, talking about just the injury sustained, what these kids went through, not even the physical trauma, the emotional, mental trauma as well. And you've talked about that as well.
Yes. The emotional and spiritual abuse, I mean, it took me, I'm still in therapy every week for it. There's no, and again, it was almost 15 years ago, and I'm still daily, like, I mean, through this experience for months, there's been a tremendous amount of healing on my end, which just goes to show how important accountability is for the victims.
Right.
But no, I mean, this doesn't, the invisibility of harm almost, it makes it even worse, because if those kids didn't have those horrifying physical marks on their bodies, would this ever have been intervened?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think about that, whether if Russell never escaped, what would have happened. Look, I know we have to let you go, but I did want to ask you real quickly about something that really struck me and how this all went down, is that Ruby Franke pled guilty. She was going to testify against Jodi Hildebrandt, but her lawyers, right before the plea agreement, or before the plea hearing, they released this statement, and I read it in part, and it says, again, initially, Ms. Franke believed that Jodi Hildebrandt had the insight to offer a path to continual improvement. Ms. Hildebrandt took advantage of this quest and twisted it into something heinous. Over an extended period, Ms. Hildebrandt systematically isolated Ruby Franke from her extended family, older children, and her husband, Kevin Franke. This prolonged isolation resulted in Ms. Franke being subjected to a distorted sense of morality, shaped by Ms. Hildebrandt's influence. What is your reaction to Ruby Franke throwing Jodi Hildebrandt under the bus and was going to testify against her?
Yeah, no, it's hearing that Ruby was going to testify against Jodi just shows me that they had a lot more on Jodi. Like, the fact that Jodi got off on only 4 counts of child abuse, which is significant, and in my opinion, nothing compared to what they probably had on her. And as I want to say that Ruby is an adult. Ruby is the mother, she is responsible for her children, and she is responsible for what happens to her children. Full stop. And I fully agree. Like, I can completely understand where he is coming from in that statement. I don't agree with her not having responsibility. She deserves every one of those counts of child abuse. But Jodi is one of the most manipulative, and it is systematic. And I know that the last time that I was on here, I talked about that, how it was with me. It's like line upon line, precept upon precept conditioning. It's like you're this frog being boiled alive in water so slowly that you don't realize it's happening until it's already happened.
Jessi, before I let you go, one last quick question. You mentioned what the prosecutor said could be a potential sentence for Jodi Hildebrandt, the maximum. Did the prosecutor give you any indication about what the potential sentence for Ruby Franke would be?
I didn't ask, honestly.
Right.
Just that's not the connection I have to this case.
I got you. Jessi Hildebrandt, again, thank you so much for coming on. So sorry again for everything that you've gone through and you're continuing to go through, especially as this case became so national and became on the forefront and the conversation developed about it. But again, thank you so much for your bravery to come on, speak about what happened, and we wish you the best of luck as this case progresses.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody, that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.